Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We have been in the midst, or in the depths, I should say, of the Crusades.
Yes.
Although those of us from St. Louis who listen to the show will at least like part of what we were discussing today.
That's right.
We will be discussing our namesake in the city of St. Louis.
St. Louis.
St. Louis,
yeah,
King of France, St. Louis the Ninth.
Right, right. Yeah, he's a wonderful, just a remarkable medieval character. And it's so much like the Middle Ages that he has a contemporary who was so much the opposite of him, that being the Emperor Frederick II of Germany.
Boo hiss. We talked about him a little bit last week.
Yeah, that's right. So let's jump in and talk about some good things first. Louis the Ninth.
That sounds a good place to start.
He was born at Poissy in France on April 15th of 1215, and he had some wonderful parents. You know, his dad was the King of France, Louis VIII, and his mother was Blanche of Castile. And both, especially Blanche, had a tremendous influence on his life because his father died when he was 11 years old. And so he became king during that period of time, but his mother was regent. And for the next 8 years. These were hard years in France. We have an impression that medieval France is sort of Disneyland or something, and it certainly isn't. There are all kinds of things going on. And Blanche, she's from Castile, so it's Spain, has her hands full during that time until her son could come to his majority at the age of 19. She had revolts from the Count of Languedoc in southern France, of Brittany. There was even an uprising in the Ile-de-France, which is the central portion of France, Paris and that area there. So even the home area wasn't safe. And then there were all these adventures on the part of the King of England, who was, of course, also a vassal to the King of France, this being Henry III. Add all that, and then you go down into the southern part of France, and in the city of Albi, there is a whole group of these people that take on sort of a manichaeistic faith of a dualism. They're called the Manichaeans, the Albigensians, and so that's a heresy there, an uprising against the central authority of the church there. And throughout all of this, she found that she could, and Louis, little young teenage Louis, had one support that they could always turn to, and that was a cardinal who was the papal legate to the French. His name is Cardinal Frangipani, and he gave them all the solace that he could in the midst of all of these incredible confrontations. At the age of 19, Louis then was married to Marguerite of Provence. They had 11 children, huge family. But being king, he could afford to take good care of these kids, and he also gave them some wonderful advice. I'll take a little reading a little bit later on for his children. Again, he found himself, no sooner had he come into his majority than he found himself again at war with Henry III and Henry's French allies, and in 1242. He succeeded in scoring a major victory, and with that, the Peace of Bordeaux. And so France then was pacified. He then turned his attention to the Crusades, and here's the call of the Crusades. He leaves France and leaves his mother, Blanche, in charge of the country. She had done a pretty good job running it while he was a teenager, and so He left her, continued to do that. It was not easy again. No sooner had he left, and there were other marauders and brigands and all kinds of things. And many of these people targeted the clergy in particular, murdering the clergy, stealing from the church. There was many of them followed. It was a gang, is what it was. They became known as the Pastoral, the country folk, and but this was a gang. And it followed a fellow just simply known as the Hungarian Master. We don't know anything more about him than that. But if you could imagine these marauders just going around stealing from everybody, but especially going after the defenseless, and that would include the clergy, and stealing from the church and all. Louis had taken up the cross in 1244. But one of the problems he had from the very beginning was how to fund this crusade. And it was the Council of Lyon around that time that had called for a crusade, and it also authorized that 5% of the church revenues would go to the king for 3 years. And so the church in France would take 5% of its revenues and use this specifically for the king, for his crusade. And then also they authorized a 10% income on 10% tax on clerical income. So they're not touching the people in general here. Remember, over in England they had the Saladin tax, where everybody paid, except for crusaders themselves. But this is basically going to be coming from the church treasury itself.
Okay.
Yeah. Later, that would be extended for another 2 more years. And historians have noted that if you look at the funding for this crusade, Louis' crusades, that basically 66% of the crusades were underwritten by the church in France. So they themselves are paying for this. There's an interesting controversy that comes out of this. There's a document that's discovered called the Pragmatic Sanction, and I want to clear this up before we go much further. And supposedly, it's a controversy in which Louis had been prohibited from certain kinds of collections, and or he had rather he had prohibited certain kinds of collections, the use of simony, and then also in this document refused to allow French clergy to pay any kind of fees or tributes to the Roman Curia, so that the money would be used in France. But centuries later it was discovered that this was a forgery.
Oh.
So this particular document, it's called the Pragmatic Sanction, in fact was a 14th century forgery that was set up in order to try to break the French clergy away from the Roman pontiff, and using St. Louis's name on this.
Oh my
so we
goodness.
just have to keep in mind that sometimes there are documents that float around that are not real. And so I just wanted to bring that little Pragmatic Sanction question up while we were looking at funding the Crusader taxes, to remind everyone that was in fact a forgery that was done basically for the Gallican Church, the French Church, seeing itself as more separated from the Universal Church. It wasn't true. Nonetheless, the question about Crusader taxes is an interesting one, and one of the things that is developed during this period is the concept that if you can't go on a crusade yourself, by contributing, now we're not talking a tax here, but a donation, by contributing to the crusades, that if it only is a question of alms, that you would receive, along with saying 3 Our Fathers for the success of the crusade, there would be some kind of a partial indulgence involved in this. And we find as early as 1195, Pope Celestine III writing to the bishops in England and saying this, and I quote here, those who send of their goods in aid of the Holy Land shall receive pardon for their sins, from their bishop on the terms that he shall prescribe. So keep that in mind. That's that little caveat part there, that it's up to the bishop of that diocese for that partial indulgence, and he'll prescribe how that would take place. Later in the Fourth Lateran Council, that very important council in 1215, we find the introduction of a plenary indulgence for contributions. And again, if we read the fine print there, it's in proportion to their means. Mm-hmm. That is to say that a wealthy man who gives a donation receives this plenary indulgence, but a poor man who gives a much smaller portion receives the plenary indulgence also. It's based upon your own ability to give these kinds of these gifts. And actually what happens then is that there is a flood, as we get into the later Crusades, there's a flood of funding that comes into the Crusader coffins to help pay for remember the logistics on these are very, very expensive. What it costs in order to keep a knight in his saddle is very expensive. And so we find all throughout Europe the laity using this as an opportunity to express their devotion and so make these contributions when they can't go on the Crusades themselves. And now, there is, however, going to be a problem with this down the line. You're probably thinking to yourself, Johann Tetzel, 1517, yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. This will be abused. Right. And so the whole theology and the doctrinal purity of this is going to, unfortunately, be abused a couple hundred years later on. But that's where this concept comes from. Then also there's another tax that I'd alluded to of a clerical tithe, and this now really truly is a tax, and then ultimately this will be spread out to the rest of France in a national tax on property. This is the first time this has ever been done in France. It has been done previously in England as a result of the Saladin tax of Richard I. But in France, this is the first time there is actually going to be a tax on all property. And so there's a lot of question about this. The Council of Tours in 1163 had forbade bishops from paying this tax on church property. And so you see that separation of church and state being debated even in the Middle Ages there. The Third Lateran Council in 1179 says that the tax is allowed if the clergy consent to it. So in some dioceses, the bishop will say, yes, I'll pay the 10% tax on the property. Other dioceses, they say, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's up to the bishop to make that decision. And then in the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the other decrees there is, and this of course is in 1215, that a bishop should never pay a tithe without the Pope's consent. Okay. And this at the same time that Pope Innocent III has placed a 5% tax on clergy to support these crusades. Well, with all that money that's raised then, Louis IX buys what he needs by way of foodstuffs and fodder and supplies, and all of these are shipped to the island of Cyprus. So Cyprus is going to be the jumping off point. And as you look at the whole arch of Islam in the Holy Land, once again, he's got to come up with a decision as to where the best place is for him to put his effort. And he gathers with him some 1,500 knights, around 5,000 crossbowmen, and then about 20,000 other soldiers and personnel. Now, for the most part, these are French coming out of his kingdom, but there are other volunteers out of northern and other parts of Western Europe who have come to join him. I guess part of it, is the adventure of going on a crusade. Part of it is the idea, if I die on the crusade, the possibilities of a plenary indulgence, and part of it probably is just the attractiveness of traveling with a man who is obviously a saint.
Mm-hmm.
This is a man who says the office every day.
Right.
Attends mass every day. He definitely lives his faith. And so they gathered on Cyprus, this in May of 1249. And as they look around, they decide that the best thing for them to do is to attack Egypt, because that's where the real power is in the Muslim world at the time. And so they land, and they succeed in taking the fortress town of Damietta. Are you catching a little deja vu here?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah. They did it again.
They did,
After taking Damietta, they began moving up the Nile River, that is to say south, toward Cairo. And once again, the Muslims pull a fast one on them, and they send troops by ship around behind the Crusaders. And ultimately, the Crusaders, King Louis himself, is caught in this trap. And so the whole darn army surrenders, including Louis IX. Ultimately, the negotiations for his release and the release of the other nobles is going to come through his wife, Marguerite. And the decision that is, or the sum that comes to for the release of Louis and these nobles is that it would be 2 times the royal annual income for the entire year.
Oh my gosh.
That's a bunch of bucks. And so with that, he was released, and that's the end of the Seventh Crusade.
Wow.
The Sultan eventually received half of that amount. So he received the annual income from the royal income for an entire year, and then the other half never showed up, and he never expected it, and it never came.
Never came.
But he
was probably pretty happy with that.
He was pretty happy with that. That's right. Yeah. This was in 1254,
oh my gosh.
And this is the end of the Seventh Crusade. The Sixth Crusade is considered to be Frederick II's, which I'll say some more about a little bit later on. Louis did not go back to France. Instead, what he did was he went to the city of Acre, and along with some of the other crusaders, they considered their options, and after 4 years decided to go back home. It was
4 years.
Yeah, 4 years. And then he went back to France. This is in 1258. And then from 1258 to 1270, he ruled France and brought about this peaceable kingdom based upon justice and devotion. Here, truly a culture of caritas. Mm-hmm. And, the stories about him are just phenomenal. He is the model for rulers, mm-hmm. To live a life. And one of the things he finds himself doing is defending the Pope Innocent IV, against Frederick II, of whom we'll be talking about. His government is called the Curia Regis, the office of the king, and it is watched carefully by contemporaries as well as those who follow after as truly applied Christian jurisprudence. Mm-hmm. And without going into any much more detail than that, it's a sign of that. I'll tell you another thing he did too, which I never really appreciated until this summer. He built a chapel on the Ile de la Cité, the island that's in the middle of the Seine River. The Notre Dame is there, but he built this incredible, beautiful chapel called Sainte-Chapelle, the Holy Chapel. And I would tell anybody, if you ever get to Paris, don't miss this one, especially on a sunny day. Because this chapel, the chapel itself is actually on the second floor. So you come in, and then you climb to the second floor. And when you walk into this chapel, which is the size of a modest parish church, it's not real big. It's very Gothic, very high, and it is the walls, with the exception of the ribbing, the stone ribbing. With that exception, the walls are all stained glass.
Oh, wow.
And the glass is absolutely incredible. It catches the sun, and it's shown all over the chapel itself. I was there with probably 200 other people, but I've never had an experience like this except for the Sistine Chapel. When I walked in there, probably had 200 people there too,
Yeah.
And yet I was the only one there. And I had the same experience of going into Sainte-Chapelle. You walk into that, and everybody else is just in their own world. I'm in my world, and I'm just soaking in the beauty of these stained glass windows. They're absolutely incredible. The chapel itself was built in order to house a crown of thorns, which had been given to St. Louis as a gift from the Crusaders in the East, as a tribute of their devotion to him. It was believed at the time, I don't know how the pedigree is, it was believed that was the crown of thorns that Jesus had worn at the crucifixion. Whether that's true or not, the fact of the matter is that I don't even know where that artifact or that relic is today, but by golly, the Sainte-Chapelle is still there, and it's a beautiful sign and expression of the devotion of this man.
Oh, St. Louis.
Yeah. He also helped Robert of Sorbonne in order to found a college in Paris known as the Collège de la Sorbonne. Today we just call it the Sorbonne.
Mm-hmm.
Originally it was to endow the faculty, the theological faculty at the University of Paris. And so that'll be a very important aspect also. We'll be talking quite a bit about medieval universities and medieval philosophy and theology in a couple of weeks when we get into happier topics. But as we do that, that was also helped by St. Louis. It's well known that today that he fed out of his own resources. He fed 100 people a day in Paris. The poorest of the poor were taken into his refectories, and 100 a day were fed out of his own resources, especially lepers. He founded hospitals at a time when nobody had hospitals. He had one hospital established in Paris and it could house 300 blind people. Yeah. So it was very solicitous to the blind. And also another hospital that was established, actually was not a hospital in the sense that we understand hospitals, but sort of a rooming house or a boarding house. It was known as the Hotel Dieu, God's Hotel, or God's Hostel, and that was set up for women who left prostitution in order to live holy lives, as Molly Kelly used to refer to the secondary virginity, a second-time virginity, and to live lives like that, so that they would be able to do that without the draw back into their sinful ways. And so there you have yet another. This was just this absolutely incredible application of Christian jurisprudence. Right. And it spread. He
saw a need and he took care of it.
I'm sorry?
He would see a need and he took care of it.
Yes, that's exactly it. And so finally, after having done all of this, he heard the call of the Crusades again. And in 1270, he then went on another crusade, this time landing in Tunis, kind of far away from the center of the Holy Land. But he arrives there, dies at the age of 55.
Wow.
He's a relatively young man. And within 3 years, the process of his canonization was already introduced. It was obvious that this man was a living saint. And then finally, in 1297, he would be canonized by Pope Boniface VIII, which is an interesting thing in itself, because if you remember the early part of the modern church history, Boniface VIII ultimately would suffer grievously. I mean, he'd be beaten and ultimately die from his beating at the hands of the grandson of St. Louis. This is Philip the Fair, Philip IV of France.
Oh my goodness.
And so here we're beginning to see some lapovers between that 80-part series that we had done on modern church history and coming then to the fruition of the medieval church history. Here we have Louis IX, and I'm going to read you a little section of his advice to his children, and then a generation after that, his own grandchild will lead to the death of a pope, this William of Nogeray. Remember that?
I do remember that.
Oh, but that's the very pope who's going to canonize this man's grandfather. Listen to what St. Louis writes as advice to his son. Okay. This is so poignant, and this is out of the Office of Readings for August 25th for St. Louis, and he writes this. He says, "My dearest son, my first instruction is that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your strength. Without this, there is no salvation. Keep yourself, my son, from everything that you know displeases God, that is to say, from every mortal sin. You should permit yourself to be tormented by every kind of martyrdom before you would allow yourself to commit a mortal sin." And then listen to this. "Be devout and obedient to our mother, the Church of Rome, and the Supreme Pontiff as your spiritual father. Work to remove all sin from your land, particularly blasphemies and heresies." Boy, was that lost on his grandson.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
Beautiful advice for any of us and our children.
Yeah, that's right. So,
wow.
Well, not
amazing what one generation can do, isn't it?
Oh, isn't it incredible?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But the seeds of that next generation was already sitting over in Germany. And as much as I've enjoyed talking about Louis, now we got to talk about Frederick.
Now we're back to those crusade days again.
Right, yeah. Okay, ready?
Okay, all right, I'm ready.
Okay, button up your boots. It's going to get pretty bad in here. There's a Franciscan who spoke of Frederick II, and he says the following. His name is Salim Bien, and he said this. He said, "Of faith in God, he had none. He was crafty, wily, avaricious, lustful, malicious, wrathful, and yet a gallant man."
Okay.
Times when he would show his kindness or courtesy, full of solace, jocular, delightful, fertile in devices. To be brief, if he had been rightly Catholic and had loved God and his church, he would have had few emperors his equal in the world.
It's a big if.
It's the big if, yeah. So here is a man of incredible contrast, in an age of incredible contrast, who could have been one of the greatest holy Roman emperors, and instead is just going to tell a lie to that holy and Roman part, and be unworthy, although he is a great intellect, be unworthy to be an emperor of such a country.
Wow.
He is the son of King Henry VI, so he becomes King of Germany and then later Holy Roman Emperor. And his mother is Queen Constance of Sicily. He's going to live an unfortunately long life. He'll be born in 1194, and die in 1250. 1250. So it's 56 years, but he's going to torment 5 popes.
Wow.
The first of which was poor Pope Innocent the Third. He was Frederick was 4 years old when Innocent III was elected. When he died, Frederick was 22 years old. Now, remember, Innocent III is this great and powerful pope, and at the time of his death, now Frederick has come into his own, and then will find himself. Now, he's sort of held in control by the glory of Innocent III. I'll talk more about him a little bit later on, but also by his own youth. And by the time he's 22 years old and Innocent dies, now you're going to have a man who will turn his bent on these popes real fast. You have Honorius III. Now, Honorius III is a very nice guy, but he has no match for the meanness of Friedrich, who will be 22 years when he comes to his throne of Peter. When he dies, he'll be 33 years old. Gregory IX is going to have to live during this man's most powerful years, from 33 years old to 47 years old. When he dies, Gregory dies, he'll be replaced by Celestine IV, who lives only about 1 year. He's very sickly. And after he dies, there's going to be a 2-year hiatus in which there is no pope, mainly because of Friedrich, which I'll describe in a couple minutes. And then finally, the last pope who's going to be tormented by this guy is Pope Innocent IV. And Friedrich will be 47 years old when he's elected, and he'll die. Friedrich will die at 56 years old in 1250. Overall, his policy was to restore his family's control. He is a control freak. His family's control in Germany belongs to a family called the Hohenstaufen family. It's a big German name there. And he decides that the way to do that is not in Germany itself. Remember that Germany has had there's been some weaknesses in the German Empire going back to the struggle between Henry IV, the Emperor Henry IV, and Pope Gregory VII over Reformation and church independence from imperial control. So the imperial control has been hurt by that, and Friedrich is bound and determined to get that back. But he knows that he can't do it in Germany. And so instead what he does is he builds up a strong base in southern Italy. Remember, his mother is from Sicily. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it's on his mom's side that he's going to secure southern Italy, and he does this very heavy-handedly, very autocratically. I think I mentioned before that one of the things he would do is when a bishop died in those dioceses down there, he would not permit another bishop to take his place. So he would simply refuse to allow the Pope to place a bishop in charge of that diocese, and instead he would place an administrator, maybe a priest, maybe a layman, to run that diocese instead, as if it were some kind of a civil administrative post, you know. This is going to give him strength, and particularly as he claims the title King of Italy. He's going to have opponents to that title, and two in particular, one of those being the papacy itself. So there's always going to be a struggle between him and each of the popes during his lifetime. And then also in the northern part of the country, you're going to have what's known as the Lombard cities. The cities among the Lombards in the Po River Valley, they're going to want to be independent also, and they don't want this guy coming in and being heavy-handed with them. But that's his strategy. His strategy is to get control of southern Italy, and then to move over, using that to take over all of Italy, and then the wealth of Italy would be used in order to gain control in Germany. keep always in mind that he is, although his father was German, by sentiment, Friedrich is much more favors much more the Italian side, and not only just the Italian side, but the southern Italian side, his mother's side, Sicilian. So he is soaked in Norman. Remember those Norman Sicilians? Norman, the Greek influence that comes from the Mediterranean, even in the Sicily, and then also Muslim influence. He is very enamored with the Norman Sicilian, the Greek, and the Muslim cultures. He is one of the few monarchs of Europe who spoke and wrote fluently Arabic. And, you know, you have to admire that. That's not an easy language to get into. He prefers the sun of the Mediterranean to the gray skies of the Northern Sea. I don't understand that at all. I'd much rather be in gloomy weather, but, well, to each his own. You know, interesting, Teresa, I went ahead and as I was reading through some of this, I thought to myself, I wonder what New Advent has to say about him. You know, the Catholic Encyclopedia. And you know what I found was I think they were overly nice to this man. You know, if you go and read online...
Boy, that's hard to believe.
It really is. But they talked about his incredible acumen. Well, okay, fine. He was a pretty bright guy. You know? And they said this. They said his incredible acumen, and I quote here, increased the inclination of this skeptical spirit toward thorough empiricism. I don't know who wrote that.
That's not what I would have written about this man.
No, I wouldn't either. I mean, let me tell you some stories about his incredible and thorough empiricism. Some of it involved murder. Now, these are stories that are handed down from his enemies. So take some of this with a grain of salt. But there's so many coming from so many different sources. I have to say that there must be some truth to this. And in fact, everything else we know about him, it's not out of character.
Right.
There is a story that he took two men, and he fed them a fine banquet. Okay, they had a wonderful meal, ate all they wanted, drank all they wanted, and then one was sent off to bed to sleep, and the other one was sent out hunting. And all night long, he went through the forest and hunted and caught all the animals he could and all that. In the morning, Friedrich II brought the two in together. Okay. He had them disemboweled to see how much was digested through sleep and how much through activity.
Oh my gosh!
This is a sicko.
Yes, indeed.
You know, this is. There's another story, and once again, it comes from a different source, and it's not beyond the realm of belief, where he took one of his servants and he placed him in a great big vat of like vinegar or some liquid. And he had him drowned. And he gathered people all around to watch the drowning of this man and to look carefully to see whether or not they could see his soul leave his body at the moment of death. Now, that might be just a story. Like I say, there's so many of these stories, and they come from so many different sources. And the way this man led his life, I mean, I'm going to give you some history stuff that points to some of this. There's something to this. This is a very sick individual, and he's in charge of a country.
All right.
Well, on the other hand, we can look at some of the deeds of Saddam Hussein too.
Yes,
and,
yeah.
They weren't much prettier than this. He took the title Romanorum Imperator Semper Augustus Jerusalem et Sicilia Rex. He was of the Romans Emperor forever Augustus, of Jerusalem and Sicily King. Yeah, oof. He has the distinction of being excommunicated when he went on a crusade. I remember earlier on I said that he was excommunicated because he wouldn't go on a crusade, never got around to it. Finally, when he decided to go on a crusade, the Pope told him don't, and he went anyway and got excommunicated yet again. It was only after the success of that crusade. Remember, he worked a deal in order to have pilgrims go to Jerusalem.
Right.
That with that the excommunication was finally lifted. Later, again, he entered into battle against the Catholic cities of the Lombards. This was in 1237. He was re-excommunicated again. He was called by many in the church the blasphemous beast of the apocalypse. You could almost imagine a red dragon as this guy's symbol.
Right.
Well, the end of this story is going to have a very chilling thing about red. Gregory the Ninth called a council. They had many issues in the church, and not least of which was what to do with this emperor. And when he did, Frederick sent his son out with an army and captured all of the bishops on their way to the council.
Oh, no.
And he placed them in prison. So there would not be a council. This is a rare moment. I mean, this doesn't happen very often. And eventually he released the French bishops only because Louis IX had protested so strongly. But if you weren't French, you stayed in prison. He, in order to show Pope Gregory he was serious, and you don't cross this guy, he took the nephews of Pope Gregory and he hanged them.
Oh my gosh.
You know, I mean, when we get into talking about the life of St. Thomas Aquinas, he gets involved in this too. He was imprisoned. Thomas Aquinas was imprisoned by his brothers. He was put into a castle. His brother was pro-Friedrich, and they were afraid that Thomas might say something against the emperor, and so for his own protection, it's a long, involved story where his whole family tried to get him not to become a Dominican, and we'll talk about that later. But he was imprisoned by his brother in order to keep a low profile so he wouldn't say something against the emperor and get himself killed. Ultimately, his own brother, who had been pro-Friedrich, said something in the wrong direction, and he was struck down. He was killed by this guy. In the summer of 1241, it was a very terrible heat wave that hit Rome, which we know happens every once in a while. And Pope Gregory was in Rome. He was grieving over the loss of his beloved nephews. The turmoil in Rome itself, in Italy, in the church, as a result. I mean, all of his bishops were being held, with the exception of the French ones, who were now back under the protection of St. Louis. Everyone else was, in these prisons, and just in absolute grief, he died. This is in August of 1241. So what happens, conclave? The cardinals are very, very afraid. Two of the cardinals are still being held in prison. Two others were away, and they would not come to Rome. One could understand. 10 of them gathered in Rome. Of the 10 that were there, from what we could tell, 6 of them were in what we could call the peace camp. They wanted to make peace with the emperor and do anything that the emperor wanted in order to bring the church back together again, in order to release all these bishops. 4 of the cardinals who gathered stood absolutely against him. They saw him as the beast from the apocalypse. His nickname is the Stupor Mundi, the stupor of the world. And so as a result of this, you could not get a 2/3 majority out of this College of Cardinals, and so there was a stalemate. This went on for some while. Remember, there's going to be a couple years in which, well, anyway, what happens is that one of the Roman senators, his name is Matteo Orsini. The Orsini family is very, very powerful. We see them from time to time. In order to force the bishops to come up with a vote, he then locked them up And then what got worse was when they still, locked in the building, were not able to come up with some kind of a compromise candidate. He then had them shackled so that their hands and feet were tied together, and they were put into a room, if you can imagine this, put into a room below a leaky latrine.
Oh my gosh.
And then, after days of this terrible privation, he then threatened them, Count Orsini threatened them that he would exhume the body of Gregory the Ninth and put that body in the room with them. This is horrible.
These are the cardinals of the church.
These are the cardinals of the church. One of those cardinals died under the privation of all this. Well, you could understand. This was Cardinal Robert of Somercote. He was an English cardinal. Another cardinal, Cardinal Sinibaldi Fieschi, became very ill. And then it turns out that on the one side, one of them was in favor of compromise and the other one was against compromise. So even with the death of one and the infirmity of the other, it didn't change the vote of these cardinals at all. Eventually, the three cardinals who were left, who were anti-Frederick, simply gave up. And they ended up voting a very elderly man as Pope. This was Godfrey of Castiglione, who was elected and then died almost immediately afterwards because of the privation he had gone through. Count Orsini had freed the freed the cardinals after their election, and, well, guess what? Most of them took out as fast as they could and got as far away as possible. It'd be a year and a half before another conclave could be held. And this is going to be at Anani, outside of Rome. The cardinals are going to elect Cardinal Sinibaldi Fieschi. Remember, this was the man who had almost died in that terrible prison latrine. And he's elected Pope. He takes the title Innocent IV. He is clearly anti-Friedrich, and Friedrich is clearly going to kill him. And so he flees out of Rome and goes to France. And there he takes up residence in Lyon, where he then excommunicates Friedrich once again. And it's on December 12th. I'm sorry, it was December. I don't know the day, but December 13th. Anyway, in December of 1250, Friedrich, now under excommunication, all of a sudden develops a very bad case of dysentery. He's in southern Italy. On December 7th, he makes a will. 5 days later, on the 12th, he dies. And his body is then taken to the cathedral at Palermo.
That's very generous.
Yeah. He is escorted by Saracen bodyguards. These are Muslim bodyguards. Bring him to the cathedral at Palermo, and there a sarcophagus has already been prepared for him. It's made of red stone. Here's that red coming in there, with 4 carved lions on it. His body is wrapped in linen with arabesque designs on it. The only sign that he had any Christian roots at all is on his left shoulder. There was a small Crusader cross that was attached. Innocent IV rejoiced when he heard the death of this terrible man. All of Rome rejoiced when they heard of the death of this terrible man. This is in 1250. Now, when we start looking at dates, remember that we started the early modern period in 1274.
Right.
So this is the 13th century. This is that greatest of all centuries that historians refer to. But the greatest of all centuries, if we started from the moment of the death of this evil man, Frederick II, and then we end it at the death of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Council of Lyon, and then shortly after this incredible dying off of church leaders, that all starts in 1274. The greatest of all centuries is only 25 years long.
Wow.
Stuffed into that is going to be the likes of St. Francis, St. Dominic, Innocent III, Thomas Aquinas, University of Paris, the Sorbonne, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and Summa Theologica.
Wow.
I mean, that's going to be the glory of Christendom, as Warren Carroll points out. But it is only going to be 25 years.
I keep thinking back to the blood of the martyrs, but the blood of the the wicked may have produced some glory too, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! We did have. Wow.
Fascinating. Just fascinating, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
You can't write this stuff.
No, you couldn't write a novel this good. What we'll do is we'll be turning then to take a look at the new prosperity of Europe in the same period that we've just been talking about. There are a lot of other people besides these kings,
Right.
and so we're going to be looking at some of them and how prosperity returns to Europe. We'll also be looking at at another religious order, the Cistercian order, and how they reformed the Cluniac reformers. There's a new need for that. We'll be taking a look at some of the real challenges to the church down in southern France. I mentioned that Innocent went to Lyon. Lyon's a terribly important city going back to Irenaeus, in the 2nd century of church history, and yet coming out of Lyon is going to be one of the early heretics of the church. This is Peter Waldo, and we'll take a look at him and at Francis of Assisi and how the two are so very much alike and very different. And we'll be looking at the Albigensians, which I alluded to before, and St. Dominic and the coming of the Dominicans. And then getting into this great period of medieval learning.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
It's nice to get away from the Crusades.
Isn't it? Yeah, I'm getting a little tired of that.
All right. Well, Father, thank you so much.
Okay.
Look at the good and the bad today, I guess.
Yeah, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right. So we close with the prayer and the blessing.
Okay. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.